He taught a lot of people how to deal with chaos. He believed that pain makes us stronger, that taking responsibility is the best way to fight hopelessness, and that the only way to face the darkness of the world is to stare it straight in the eyes and not blink. Finally, he disappeared in silence. There was no farewell speech or loud exit, there was only quiet. That place used to have one of the loudest, most discussed, and most searched voices in the world. Clinical psychologist, Harvard professor, and author of one of the most read books of the 21st century, Jordan Peterson, had spent decades getting people ready to deal with their worst times. He had sat next to patients who were drowning in drug abuse, grief, and a lack of purpose in life and given them a thread to help them get back from the edge. What happens, though, when the person who wrote the rules can't follow them anymore? What happens when the body of the man who tried to bring order to the world falls apart? Take a moment to think about that. You built your life around something, but all of a sudden it turned against you. Tell us what you think about that question below. It's what this story is all about. When Jordan Peterson got sick in 2025, he was rushed to urgent care. His daughter Michaela said that those weeks were like being very close to dying. He wasn't able to talk to his family for almost a month. The man whose words had brought millions of people together could no longer talk to anyone. But the story doesn't start in a hospital room. It starts in a small, frosty town in the northwest of Alberta, Canada. There, a quiet boy sat in a library and began to ask so many big questions that they would finally shake the whole Western world. After going through the halls of Harvard, courts, a medically forced coma in Russia, years of public war with governments and universities, a family fighting cancer, and finally the moldy room that almost ended everything, the story ends there. This isn't a story about a famous person getting sick. This story is about what it takes to carry truth and what happens to a man who does it farther than his body was ever meant to go. Please stay with us until we get to the hospital room. We need to know who Jordan Peterson really was before everyone knew his name. Jordan Bernd Peterson wasn't born into a wealthy family. He didn't grow up in a home where greatness seems inevitable, where dinner talks are full of intellectual ideas and philosophy books are piled high on the shelves. He was born on June 12, 1962, in Edmonton, Alberta. He grew up in Fairview, a small, worn-out town in the far northwest of Canada. That kind of place where winters last long enough to teach you that you have to be strong. Walt, his dad, worked as a teacher. Beverly, his mother, worked as a librarian at the Grande Prairie Regional College site close to home. They did not have a lot of money. Even though they weren't linked, they were a rare find in the home of a future thinker. They were there, and they wanted to learn. And Jordan grew up in a town where desire could easily stop before it found a way to move forward. He was surrounded by books, which were always there to give him calm authority. He became very interested in books, which was his first love. Sandy Notley, a school librarian, introduced Peterson to works that most people never even think about. Notley's daughter Rachel would go on to become Premier of Alberta. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Ayn Rand, George Orwell, and Aldous Huxley. These weren't books to read for comfort. People who wrote these works refused to look away from the machinery of totalitarianism, ideology, and human pain. Jordan Peterson read them all when he was just a teenager living in a cold prairie town. Something in them made him feel uneasy in a way that would never go away. Take some time to think about this question. What book or one idea? The first thing it did was show you that the world was more difficult than you thought. Enter it in the box below. Because for Peterson, the answer to that question changed the course of his life in every way. By the time he was a teenager, he had joined the New Democratic Party, which is on the left of politics. Like many optimistic teens, he thought that the right system could fix the world. He didn't know what it was, though. He thought that the real question wasn't which political party was right, but why people kept choosing chaos and cruelty even when they thought they were building paradise. This feeling grew stronger as he read more about ideology and how smart, well-meaning people had set up systems in the 20th century that ended in disaster. He left the party when he was 18 not because he was cynical but because he wanted more. First he went to Grande Prairie Regional College. Then he moved to the University of Alberta and got a degree in political science there in 1982. He found that political science only touched on the surface of the issue, though. The real question is why people follow ideas that hurt others. What gives someone the power to do real evil? What's the difference between a life with meaning and one that falls apart slowly? Those people lived somewhere else. They lived in mental health. He went back to the University of Alberta and got his second bachelor's degree in 1984. This time it was in psychology. Then he went to McGill University in Montreal to get his PhD under the guidance of Robert O. Peel, who was one of the world's top experts on addiction and violence. See, his graduate thesis looked at the mental traits that made people more likely to become alcoholics. He wasn't just collecting school records. He was slowly putting together a plan for how to understand the deepest parts of the human mind. He got his PhD in clinical psychology in 1991. The Harvard guys then called. Jordan Peterson lived in Arlington, Massachusetts, from 1993 to 1998. He taught and did research at one of the world's most prestigious colleges. His research was mostly about personality, violence, drug abuse, and how beliefs work in the mind. He wasn't well known. He didn't cause a stir. He was a serious, driven, and sometimes fierce professor whose students said he really changed their lives. Someone who showed them that their thoughts and actions had results. Which means that how you thought about the world affected how you lived in it. Greg Harrowitz, a novelist who used to study under Peterson at Harvard, later said that Peterson was the most important teacher he had ever had. Peterson moved back to Canada in 1998 and became a professor at the University of Toronto. In his private clinical practice, he saw about 20 people a week. He started putting together courses on mythology, psychology, and the structures of meaning that hold society together. He wasn't well known yet. He wasn't a lightning rod yet. Just a professor, but his ideas were important enough to scare some people and excite others. His first book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, came out in 1999. It was a thick to sprawling work that tried to come up with a unified theory of how people make sense of chaos. He wrote it for 13 years. At first, not even enough books were sold to fill a small living room. It didn't matter. The thoughts were already living. They were already making their way through his classes, clinics, and talks. And Jordan Peterson, the quiet boy from Fairview who had read Solzhenitsyn in the school library while the prairie outside was covered in snow, was changing into someone he had never meant to be. In the end, the world would not be able to ignore the man he was becoming. That kind of care doesn't come for free, though. And Jordan Peterson would pay a price for it one day that no book had ever told him about. Jordan Peterson had done everything that a serious scholar should do for 20 years. He put out studies. He was a teacher. He took care of people. His thoughts were built up slowly and carefully, like how a cathedral is put together, stone by stone, without waiting for praise. Then, in September 2016, he put a movie on YouTube. It's actually 3 videos in a simple style. There was no studio lighting or production team, just a professor sitting at his desk and talking into a camera. He said things that more and more people had been thinking but had never heard someone in charge say out loud. Professor Against Political Correctness was the name of the movies. Peterson said in them that he would not use gender-neutral pronouns with University of Toronto students or staff, even though the government has told him to. He said that the Canadian Parliament was getting ready to pass Bill C-16, which would make gender identity and expression protected under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Peterson said that making a citizen use a certain language under the fear of legal action was wrong and that free societies should never do that. He said it was forced speaking. He called it the first step toward the kind of intellectual control that he had studied for decades in the 19th and 20th centuries. The school made threats against him. Activist students sat down with him on campus. The faculty groups spoke out against him in public. The internet went crazy as reporters rushed to call him dangerous. In just 1 month, more than $400,000 worth of people watched his movies. In just 1 year, his Patreon income went from $1,000 a month to over $50,000. Letters from all over the world, mostly from young guys but also from women and people from all walks of life, said basically the same thing. I believed I was the only one who felt this way. Now, here's something to think about. Do you think someone should ever be forced by the law to use certain words, or do you think that goes too far? Leave a note below because that one question split a country and set off one of the most unlikely intellectual careers in recent history. There were planned protests on campus, but Peterson did not back down. He did not back down from the university, the press, or the protests. Someone who stood in the middle of the storm and kept cool was praised by some as brave and criticized by others as irritating. He had spent 40 years studying dictatorships. With such strong belief that it was almost physical, he thought that the pattern he was seeing play out had happened before. And that set of rules ended badly. The resistance made him stand out more as they pushed him. 12 Rules for Living by 2018. A solution to the chaos was made public. The book wasn't for school. It wasn't a party platform. It was something less common and harder to put into a category. A serious collection of thoughts written in everyday language that most people can understand. Based on psychology, myths, evolutionary biology, and the hard-won clinical knowledge that can only come from seeing real people suffer for 20 years. 10 million copies were sold. He was on shows all over the world. He had arguments with scientists, reporters, and well-known thinkers. On podcasts, he talked for 3 to 4 hours, and millions of people watched them. The New York Times said he was one of the most important public thinkers in the Western world. But that kind of power isn't clean. It doesn't come without a shadow. The attacks got stronger as they reached farther. Some people called him a dictator, while others called him a prophet. Neither name really fit the man behind the desk. People on every side of every issue cut and pasted, rewrote, and used his words as weapons. Journalists wrote about how dangerous he was, even though they had never read his books. People in online groups who had never talked to him called him their patron saint. He was performing at a speed that, by any reasonable medical measure, could not be kept up. There were world tours, hundreds of interviews, a clinical practice, a podcast, and schoolwork that he had to do. But there was something else going on that people in the crowd couldn't see. A body that was starting to send signs that it couldn't keep up without making a noise. His eating habits had changed a lot. He said he was trying to deal with what he called an autoimmune disorder and extreme depression by only eating meat and a few vegetables starting in 2016. By 2018, he had stopped eating any veggies at all, and the diet helped with some of his symptoms. It also cut him off from the normal rhythms of life in terms of his metabolism and his social life.